Okay. Let's look at bottom of page 12. Remember, we looked at general categories of psychopathology a few pages back. We're going to be looking at the borderline personality or borderline personality disorder. Some people have suggested that we call this a borderline personality organization or just a borderline organization, which I think is a little less pathology-laden. So we want to make a proposal of what this is as attachment disorder, look at some data, and then see how this affects type. So I'm on page 13, if you will. So the DSM-4, those of you not familiar with that, is the diagnostic criteria that pretty much all therapists use for sending abominable reports to abominable insurance companies for payment of fees that are sometimes abominable. At any rate, there are frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. Well, notice abandonment there, feeling abandoned. Extremes of idealization and devaluation. You might consider, gee, which of those might be extroverted and which introverted. Unstable self-image, we've talked about that. Impulsivity in at least two areas. Could be spending, sex, substance, driving. You can see the implications here for addictive disorders. Recurrent suicidal behavior or gestures or threats or self-mutilating. We'll come back to some more examination. This is just DSM-4. Affective instability, which means changes of mood. Now, you might see, of course, that what's the difference between one who is a bipolar person and one who might be a borderline person, or perhaps one who's just in a very stressed situation, variety of other kinds of things. You see this is not easy. Chronic feelings of emptiness, inappropriate, intense anger difficulty, and a transient stress-related and paranoid ideation. Well, we're supposed to have, if we diagnose somebody with BPD, borderline personality disorder, at least 5 of these. I would like to suggest that if you look at these, you'll see the themes of lack of self, predominantly. Lack of self. As a result of lack of self, what we could simply call selfishness more predominantly is narcissism. And then we might suggest that this is what Kohut has talked about when he talks about the narcissistic wound. That I was wounded in my normal narcissistic age, which is, by the way, where my 5-year-old grandson Gavin is. You know, and it was so nice to have him with us for 5 days, and it was extremely nice to have him go home because he was appropriately narcissistic, as he should be. When I talk to parents or occasionally give an opportunity to speak on such things, I say, now, parents, the following things you should never say. Rhetorical questions including, what's wrong with you? What is your problem? Why are you acting that way? Or statements, you know better than that. Act your age. I can't believe you're doing that. Those are all shaming statements. They are all, there is something wrong with you. In fact, I will dare say, it's better to say, you know, I actually really dislike you right now. Or, I just can't stand you right now. Or even, abominable as it sounds, I hate you. A child can hear, I hate you, but how does a child answer the question, what's wrong with you? Well, do I have 2 noses? Or is there something wrong with my heart? Or I am an introvert and I shouldn't be? I mean, you ask that question, what's wrong with you? So in the heart of this, I think, borderline phenomenon is this lack of self that has come from some kind of an assault. So we're on number 45, 46, if you will. I'll give this back to Boris to do some more interesting things in a moment, but let me kind of suggest here that Boris and I are suggesting that the borderline condition is 2 things. It is, 1, an attachment disorder at basis. And secondly, listen heartily to this, you don't have to agree with it, It is the basis of all pathology. It is the basis of depression. It is the basis of anxiety. It is the basis of addictive disorders. It is the basis of what ails us, is an attachment disorder. And we'll talk and listen to you folks a little bit more about this later, but understanding that, Boris and I sort of have the idea, if you treat everybody like they're borderline, you probably can't go wrong. And then underneath that, they may not be very borderline, but we're all borderline to some degree, right? And what is borderline anyway? That used to be called, the borderline condition used to be called pseudo-schizophrenic neurosis. In other words, it looked like schizophrenia, but wasn't quite there. The borderline is almost crazy, but not really. Makes these people very challenging. So it's an attachment disorder coming from a trauma, which we looked at before. Could be mother not there, mother figure not there. I talked to, I'm sorry I forgot your name, but earlier, and he said, my mother wasn't there because she was probably an INTJ or INTP or something, but my father was there, and he said, is this mother figure? Yes, mother figure. Mother figure was there. Happened to be biologically male, but some kind of trauma that happens as a result of that. And then the word that I'll have, the concept that I'll have Boris elaborate on is then how do I adapt to that trauma? Right. How do I adapt to the trauma? Because number 3 here in our slide 46, there's a consequent lack of good self, then there's a seeking of relationships, and then there are symptoms. I'm going to give a little data here. Next couple of slides, you want to jump in, or should I just finish this piece?
If you want me to jump in, I will.
I'd like you to jump in, actually, just because I want to go on with some other stuff, a little tangential from earlier.
Well, going back then just to a couple of items in slide 45. Recurrent suicidal behavior, gestures, threats, or self-mutilation. I suspect that it may be true, and I assume it to be true when I talk with clients, patients who talk about suicide, that that is sort of a too broad term for what they really mean. And so I say, what is it in you that you want to die? Because suicide is trying to kill something. But unfortunately, it's an overgeneralization. So if there's a piece of your personality or a piece of your experience that you could kill off, what would it be? You see, I think that that gets to the point where people talk suicide or have suicidal ideas, and I suppose that a great many people have had the fantasy of suicide that have never said it out loud. So I would guess it's probably 90% of the human race has thought at some time, I'd just like to die and get out of this. I think probably it's a situation where the individual is not able to affirm her or his essential nature in the situation or in this particular period of time. Now, it may be from physical illness and pain. It may be from social situations or political situations. But that inability to affirm what one is, I would suggest, is at the root of suicidal ideas. Secondly, affective instability. Well, all right. When we are affectively unstable, I suggest that we are being messed with, that our sense of self is being messed with. Okay? I'm not acceptable, or too much is being demanded of me, or I'm being rejected. Okay? To then talk about point 3 under proposed theory, there's a consequent lack of a good sense of self. Well, as we've said about attachment experience in infancy and childhood, that attachment experience essentially wires the brain for the environment that one is in as an infant and child, I would suggest. So that we get conditioned to deal with what's around us, but it may not bring out our best potentialities. Okay? So that a good sense of self is really dependent upon that experience of knowing that the other person understands us, gets us, so-and-so sees us. We feel that we are real and authentic in the sight of that other person. That's where the good sense of self comes from, I would suggest.
Let me do an addendum to the suicidal matter.
Yes.
You might find this helpful in your work or with yourself. I find it helpful to make a distinction between I don't want to live and I want to die. Since my practice is mostly men, about a third children, with very few exceptions, the men say, I have to help them find this because they say, I don't want to live. I don't want to die, and I don't want to kill myself. I just don't want to live. Ellipses, if this is what life is. And I think it's helpful to say that. I really don't want to live if this is what life is. That doesn't mean I want to die, and it certainly doesn't mean I want to kill myself. But if you say, I don't want to live, what's somebody going to say to you? Oh, we love you, we want you to be, let's do something, let's get you fixed. I think it's a very honest and even healthy statement to make occasionally in life. I don't want to live if this is what life is. I mean, I have an MS patient who can move only this appendage this much, nothing else works. He doesn't want to live. Well, you can't blame him. But he doesn't want to die, and he's not suicidal. I'm the only one he dares tell that to. Because if he says that to anybody else, income, whatever, right? And by the way, here's an extroverted person that one time said to a nurse about the bomb that he had set off in her car, and they brought in the police, and they brought in someone else and another psychiatrist to examine this person who can't move. But he was shooting off his mouth, right? So, minor thing about that. But I think important in regards to this, the data, I know we're a little tangential, it just strikes me as interesting. The data on suicide is this, that 4 out of 5 suicides are male. 9 out of 10 suicide gestures are female. So women threaten it or attempt to do it. Men do it. That doesn't relate entirely to this, what we have in here, but it's a, I think, significant part. So.
The other thing that I would like to say, we're talking about the borderline, if we call it a diagnosis, a disorder, a kind of organization. One of the very simple but I think powerful ways of talking about it is that the person neither belongs, has a place with those around, a place in the world, nor has himself or herself. It's an in-between, it's a limbo. There's no place for me in the world. I don't belong to the world around me, the environment around me. I don't fit there, but I don't have myself either. And so there's the anxious scanning, or the seemingly exhibitionistic, or the overly emotional, or the clinging, and all these kinds of things, because there's no sense of solid footing in identity. So one could say, this is the way I am. I don't give a damn that nobody likes me. I really like myself, and I don't do anything that's illegal or hurtful to people. Nobody likes me, that's all right. Or the person that can say, I am very comfortable in the world. I like myself. But there's that in-between place that's neither nor.
Before we get back into the more important, I think, significant part of interaction with Jungian and type matters, let me just briefly run through a couple of data here. There's a good deal of this out there, but I want to just dramatically show you. You don't have much of a picture of this slide 47 on page 13 of the MMPI. It's the principal instrument given by a psychologist. It's an objective instrument, 560 questions and so on. And you, again, can't see it very well. Those of you who might be familiar with it would know that the lines across there roughly identify, there are 2 lines, horizontal lines. The lower one is approximately normal. The higher one is problematic. And what we have with anything beyond that is some kind of problem. So the first 3 or 4 dimensions of those are what used to be called neurotic, which basically are mood and physiological, psychosomatic disorders. And the last 3 or 4 dimensions are roughly psychotic and or characterological. And you see they're all elevated to some degree over that secondary line there, with one exception I'll explain in just a moment. But they're not severe. In other words, some depression, some anxiety, some psychosomatic illness on the left side. On the right side, the first elevation is paranoia, some distrust, the next is anxiety, basically, some anxiety, and then some sort of thought disorder. So what you have with a borderline person is sort of everything is wrong. And it's difficult then to really render a diagnosis because everything doesn't go, well, I'm depressed, well, I'm anxious, well, maybe I'm bipolar, maybe I don't relate very well, and I have all sorts of physiological problems and so on. So if everything is wrong, you've probably got a borderline person. We can talk to me about that later. There's some other data on that, and we'll get back to it. More importantly, or more interestingly, a test that I would suggest that you consider using is available through the author. Her name is Jane Tangney, Tangney. I think it's in the back here. She created this Tosca instrument. There are a couple of other scales on it, but she did a remarkable thing distinguishing shame and guilt. Shame, let me start with guilt. Guilt is the feeling of sadness because I evaluate what I have done and I feel that I have hurt or harmed somebody. Guilt. The key is the feeling of sadness. The origin is me. I look at myself. And the third thing is I actually learn something and make some adjustment. I improve. Guilt then is sadness that I find in myself and I improve. Shame is quite different. Shame is the feeling of fear of other people's disapproval of me. So at first it's external from others. The feeling is fear, and there's something wrong with me, not with what I have said or done. What we have with many people, unfortunately, is just the opposite of what we would like. We would like to see relatively high guilt and relatively low shame, which you see here in slide 48. And as you see, with females tend to have more shame, about the same amount of guilt, and borderlines have a whole lot more shame and about the same amount of guilt. So there's a shame piece in that. Now we're going to talk more theoretically and more importantly about adaptation in just a moment, but the top of page 14 is a study that my wife again did in her dissertation and found this as a composite of the borderline people in our population over a number of years. In other words, a total of 42 people, and putting them all together, come up with what amounts to an ISFP or an INFP profile and distinctively feeling. Now, there's a bit of an artifact here you should know because 75% of the population is feeling based. About 80% of females and about 50% of men, so that looks much more severe than it is. But I was talking with somebody, I forgot your name, INFP. Linda. I remember her typing on her name, that's abominable. Well, I'm a T, so at any rate, she was saying, well, the data, and there's some other data in the back if you want to look at in one of the appendices on this. Does this mean that people that are more subjective, I's, introverts and so on, are more pathological? No, it doesn't mean that, but it points in that direction, and we can surmise what's that about. Is that about culture? Is that about individuals? Is that about introverts can't do well in extroverted environment? But that is the objective data which we can then muse about. You can, if you like, ask about this. I suggest we just postpone that. There's a great deal of data here that we can look at another time if you like, or later if we have time. I'd really like to reserve most of our remaining time, which is now about an hour, for us, and I'll jump in from time to time.
Okay, so we've taken a grand tour, starting out with Jung's idea of introversion and extroversion as directions of attention and functioning for the purpose of adaptation, either to the world, as he calls it, the environment, the objective situations that we're in, or introversion referring to what he calls the subject, which would be us as individuals, but even more than us as particular empirical individuals, to the objective psyche that really shapes all of us, which is another story. So let's look now at the middle of page 14, adapted extroversion. Okay. Some of this is going to be review, and some of this is just adding a little more. External factors are the predominant motivating force. What we've talked about what these external factors are. They're family, the social setting, the world, the place we live, the jobs we have, responsibilities, resources, the political situation we're in, our historical period, all of this. As a matter of fact, even the ideas that are current and that are held collectively to be valid are part of, phenomenologically, experientially, the objective world. Okay? For example, I'm just starting to read a very interesting book by James K. Galbraith, the son of John Kenneth Galbraith, and he's talking about the myth, interestingly, in which we operate, the economic myth of freedom, free enterprise, open markets, and things like that. It is a belief system that is, in his view, not to be questioned. Well, there's the objectivity about that is that is one of the mental, intellectual conditions, if you will, one of the points of view, the world view in which we currently operate in this country. And so it may have been dreamt up by somebody in his study in the depths of the library, but now it is a political, economic article of faith, if you will, a belief system. And so we have to relate to that, and our politicians have to relate to that. So as Galbraith points out in this book, politicians have to say they believe in free markets, they have to say they believe in balanced budgets, and they have to believe, they say, in globalization. And if they don't, it's like saying they don't believe in God, and they're out of the picture. Now, this may sound extreme, but it is an example of one of those facts that we have to relate to, whether we like it or not. So that's an external factor. The second thing down here, Jung, on adaptation from the extroverted standpoint, says the object is ascendant over the course of psychic events. Well, now, these are quotes, obviously. What does he mean there? Object in this sense is what I just went through, the things that are out there, the beliefs that are out there, the conditions that are out there. How are they ascendant over psychic events? Well, they're ascendant over, I want to do something else in my job, but this is where I'm employed. All right? I want a different economic political system because I find it obnoxious or it goes against deep-seated beliefs. It may be ascendant over my sense of this does not suit me, but this is where I am and this is what I got to do and this is how I've got to deal with it. Although adapted extroversion will say, this is the way things are, I don't care, as Ron said, I don't care how I feel about it, you know, I deal with it. You could speak much better to this than I can, actually. Another thing that Jung says from the extroverted point of view affirms the importance of the object. You know, that's the data, it's the hard facts, it's a situation. And then one of Jung's, if you will, behavioral comments about adapted extroversion, open, sociable, jovial, or at least friendly and approachable. You know, out there, as the saying goes. You want to add anything to that? No? Okay. So there you have kind of a summary. So what does maladapted extroversion look like? Well, we looked at some of this a little earlier, and here's one of the more extensive things that he says from Psychological Types, his 1921 book, which is volume 6. An individual who adjusts himself, and notice the word adjusts himself to the external world is admittedly conforming to the style of his environment. But together with his whole surroundings, he is in an abnormal situation with respect to the universally valid laws of life. Now that's a huge statement. It could take us a while to unpack. Well, let's just take that first part of it. The person who adjusts himself. You know, he's not saying adapting, now he's saying adjusting. To the external world is admittedly conforming to the style of his environment, but together with his whole surroundings, he is in an abnormal situation with respect to universally valid laws of life. So one of the things that we're well aware of, I think, currently, the last couple of years, is the Great Recession. Now, it's an objective fact that there are many people who are financially hurting. We've all heard about foreclosures, losses of homes, losses of jobs, all this kind of stuff. Those are external facts. We can take that a step further and look behind that to working conditions for many people. All right, what is it? What happens when a person has to work 2 jobs to be able to afford to eat and live in her car? Now, we could go at that morally, we could go at that economically, but I think one of the universally valid laws of life is that people need a place to live that allows them to get enough rest to be restored. And they need enough time away from labor also to restore themselves. So is this a universal law of life that people need a certain amount of rest and they need a decent place to live, or to sleep, not on the grating, on the sidewalk, or in the alley, or in their car? I would be willing to argue that it is. But somebody who adjusts to that and says, well, that's just the way things are, times are tough, we may have to go with that, but that's adjustment, that's not adaptation. Let's take another example of a universally valid law of life, and that is how we change over time, how we age. At my present age, I'm different than I was 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. Now, do I adjust to that grumbling and try to act as though I'm 30 years younger than I am? Or do I just keep that as a fantasy? What?
I don't need to dye my hair. I suppose
I could dye my beard, so that it looks younger. The age spots on my hands, maybe there's cream that would cover that. That's adjusting. That's not adapting to it. The universal law of life is we get older and we go through changes. We can't do at 60 or 70 what we could do at 30 or 40. Life looks different. A universally valid law of life is that, as Ron pointed out earlier, we lose. We lose people. We lose opportunities. That's just the way it is. Do we adapt to that, or do we force it? Do we try to live at 70 like we lived at 30? So there is a maladaptation if somebody tries that. Okay. So maladapted extroversion is for the, and of course, ladies, I'm sure that you will, I infer, I assume, I hope, I expect that you will agree with me on this. The 75-year-old that teams up with a 25-year-old woman is not living in accordance with the laws of life. And I'm not talking about a grandfather and a granddaughter. Okay. So now, continuing that long quote, the supposed extrovert's normality must also depend essentially on whether he takes account of his subjective needs and requirements. Okay? And this is just his weak point. For the tendency of this type is so outer-directed that even the most obvious of all subjective factors, the conditions of his own body, receive scant attention. That's a powerful statement, but this is what Jung is saying. A maladapted or a failed adaptation to the objective facts of life looks like. All right. Any comment on that? Any additions you want to make? Bob?
Well, it just occurs that the objective facts of life are so hard-nosed that you're just gonna. Well, I guess Jung's point is you got to be more sure of your deep self, but the objective, requirements are there, and they're so hard, and difficult. You can't just. It sounds like he's just sort of forgetting them.
Yeah, right. Well, failing to take into account the objective facts about one's own nature. Okay, then we change over time. Okay. Yeah. So there's actually, let me continue here. On the next page, 15. One more thing on maladapted extroversion that continues up to page 15. He gets sucked into objects completely and loses himself in them. Or the extroverted type is constantly tempted to expend himself for the apparent benefit of the object, to assimilate the subject to the object. Object in this sense is outer world data, facts of the situation, external activities and involvements, those sorts of things. And, an example that I gave earlier of my relatively new patient who now has the anxiety and the long gastrointestinal workup and went through a psychiatric regimen, and now he's back with me. And he keeps going over, maybe what he's feeling is a side effect of his medications. Well, his ability to consider his reactions and the reactions that happen in him to life situations is not a skill that he has yet. So, there was another. Steve, do you want to take a round of questions at this point? Or?
Can I add, before you do that, Steve, just one moment here. I like very much what you say here, or what Jung says, and you pulled it out, is especially this last one. The extroverted type is constantly tempted to expend himself for the benefit of the object, to assimilate the subject into the object. To concretize that, I would say that the extrovert adapts, but the word, of course, would be adjusts or fuses or molds around the object.
Yeah.
And speaking as an extrovert, I would say that I adjust fairly quickly to what the environment is and do well at that. So there's an ability to forget about myself and attend to the object.
Right.
What is the object like? What does it feel? How can I adjust my vocabulary and so on? And the opposite of that would be for the introvert, to adjust and adapt the object as he takes the object into his subjective being. Would that follow or not?
Say that again, because I don't think it would. But.
Okay, my proposition here is that the extrovert will adapt herself to the external world, or perhaps adjust malfunctionally, and be malleable. The world, the person, the phenomenon needs me to be this way, I will be that way.
Right.
Potentially very profitable and dangerous.
Yeah.
The introvert, on the other side, will look at the object, take the object in, and then adjust the object, not the subject. Will adjust the object to one's subjective nature. Does that force it too much, or? I will, just as a kind of a byline of that, I will very often have, say, you or my wife or the other introverted thinkers of my life or introverted feelers will say, "Why did you say that?" And I have no freaking clue why I said it. I just said it. Right, my mouth said that, yeah. And So I'm mused about that, and now, of course, what I do with Deb, she said, well, why did you say that? You know, I'll say, well, I like red, and she'll say, well, why did you say that? And I'll say, well, I'll say it in a different way. I like red. Well, now, why do you like red? Well, I say, well, I'll say that in a different way. I like red.
Yes.
So it's adapting, and so the deficiency here with us extroverts is being able to sort of take that object in and really engage with that object, valuing self, valuing one's self interaction with it.
Okay.
I'm out of my realm of comfort here.
Well, I'm glad you were, because I was too, and I didn't have to say anything. In terms of the person with the introverted preference taking in the object and trying to mold it, or molding it, I already edited that. We may want to try to modify the outer situation, or may fight the outer situation, may hold on to, well, this is the way it should be, even though I don't like the way that it is. So in that sense, I don't know that we always succeed. We can try to shape things, to suit ourselves better, but I think that's probably what everybody does. You know, the extroverted parent is trying to shape the introverted kid to fit. You know, we need one more person on the team, so get out of it, put your book down, put down your damn book, come out here and play ball. Well, not really. Okay. All right, so if we go on then to Jungian adaptation 4, adaptive introversion, what he says here again from Psychological Types, he did it 6, the introverted attitude is normally oriented by the psychic structure, a new term which I haven't used today, oriented by the psychic structure, which is in principle hereditary and is inborn in the subject. Now, I don't know if that means that it runs down through families, but it's inborn. This must be assumed, however, to be, this must not be assumed, however, to be simply identical with the subject's ego. It's rather the psychic structure of the subject prior to any ego development. Now, I have alluded to this earlier today, and I'll read this next quote. The really fundamental subject is the self, is far more comprehensive than the ego, since the self, includes the unconscious, whereas the ego, the latter, is essentially the focal point of consciousness. So now what Jung is saying here is what I had briefly mentioned earlier on. Subjective factor is not just the personal or the ego level, but it's the psychic structure, and even of the individual, and even under that, it's a psychic structure, if you will, of the species, or the objective psyche. All right? Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to go into this to a great extent, but just to give a couple of examples, one of the, what would be a good example here? Of the objective psyche, well, all right, stages of life. That is something about apparently psychic structure. Our outlook changes as we get older. Our not only our physiology and our bodies change, but how we see the world changes. We see the world one way when we're 21. We see it another way when we're 40. We see it another way in our mid to late 50s. You know, you talk with somebody who's 80 or 85 years old, they see the world differently. These are changes, temporal, granted, but changes in psychic structure and changes in values. And those are not anything we ask for. Whoever asked to be 29 and wondering what you're going to do with your life? Who at 42 says, why am I in this predicament? My marriage is a mess, my family's a mess, I've got a good job that I hate, and I've got a mortgage that I got to keep the job to pay for it. All right? That's part of the objective psyche working on. It's part of the psychic structure. So we have to feel how to deal with that. So to be adapted is to recognize, okay, here I am in life. This is what's going on with me. This is my dream from last night that's giving me the information. This is my preference. This is my talent. Am I exercising it, developing it or not? How does adaptation look maladapted, or how does introversion look maladapted? Well, slide 55. It is characteristic peculiarity of the introvert, which is as much in keeping with his own inclination as with the general extroverted bias, to confuse his ego with the self, and to exalt it, the ego, as a subject of the psychic process. There's an awful lot. But this failure to recognize, okay, I have a consciousness, but there's something else working in me. Okay, there's more to me than just my consciousness. It's important. Thus, bringing about the aforementioned subjectivation of consciousness which alienates him from the object. So you get people who are so possessed by a vision or an idea, they're taken over by it. You might call them idealists or wayward idealists or misguided idealists, but some internal, some objective factor so fills their consciousness. And we say these people are possessed, they're crazy, but they're on a beeline for something, you know. And not having made that distinction between saying, wow, you know, something's really got a hold of me, something's really firing me up here, taking me for a ride. When we'll say, I, l'état c'est moi, you know, I am the state. Well, come on, that's a dangerous thing to do. And the result then is that there is a subjectivation of consciousness which alienates the person from all situations. So the person who's possessed like that loses the reality sense, as we call it, loses the orientation in the world. Now, this can be rather charming, you know, earlier in life, say when a child or an early adolescent suddenly discovers something and is just filled with it. And they're, you know, it gives them the opportunity in those adolescent years, I think, to highly develop a competence or a skill or an interest at the expense of everything else in life. And that's perhaps okay for a while if they don't crash and burn. But after a while, there's no more there's no longer adequate account taken, the rest of the world isn't taken into account adequately. Please.
I'm confused.
Yes.
So to confuse the ego with the self, but it sounds like what you're describing is being taken over by a part of the unconscious?
Yes.
Okay, so the part of the self becomes takes over, right?
Right.
Okay.
It's an invasion, if you will, a possession. Yeah. A fascination, which is
So it's the same as an extrovert gets taken over by the external world, and gets taken over by the introvert.
beautiful. I hope you heard that. The introvert
Go
gets
ahead and
taken
repeat
over by
the
the
question if you
external
could.
world. Came through okay, Steve?
Go ahead and repeat the question if you could.
Okay, well, so we have a similarity here, that the extrovert can be taken over by the outer world, of whatever all that means. Or the introvert can be taken over by the inner world, whatever that means. But the result is that there's a failure of adaptation on the other side. Okay?
I also like what you said here about the subjectivization. I've never thought of it that way, but I thought it was one of those ahas for me, having heard that. It's like introverts take something in and subjectivize it. In other words, adapt it. It's a little bit like what I said before. Change the object. And then I like the idea that from an unconscious standpoint, what happens is that everything becomes subjective. Instead of there is subjective, which is valuable, and there is objective, which is valuable, and there is an interface there, and there is tension between those things instead of having it all or nothing. It's a little bit like questions and answers. That we extroverts are inclined to answer questions. Introverts are inclined to ask them. So when I'm asked a question, I generally render an answer. It may be shooting from the hip, it may be profound, it may be flat out wrong, but I'm compelled to engage that. And what's on the other side, what's troubling for me is when I, on the rare time, ask a question of an introvert, almost certainly the first things out of his mouth are, I don't know, but. And it's like, I don't know, what is that?
Well, you're fortunate that your introverted person will say as much as I don't know. But, I mean, it's like dropping a rock into a well, and then you listen, and you listen, and you listen. And it seems like there's never going to be an echo. Because sometimes the question goes in, and the person is processing it, mulling it over, rolling it around, without acknowledging having heard your question. But that's really that internal processing, trying to feel around it, what's the response to this that actually fits it. But you don't even get an acknowledgement from some people, it's very frustrating. Okay. All right. Let's see, where are we with time?
We have about 45 minutes. I would propose that we have a time of questions, and then I think I'd like to do together with you some summary here. It looks short, but I think a number of things that I think each of us or conjointly we'd like to do. But Steve, maybe we can ask you to assist us again with questions if there be any on screen or elsewhere, and here and there. You take the lead.
Yes, absolutely. Will do. Thank you very much. We do have an email question coming from Flat Rock, North Carolina, and says, are Boris and Ron saying that there is a genetic component to type? It sounds like they are suggesting that there is something developing prior to entering the external environment. Any comments on that?
Yes.
Good. What would those be?
That was Jung's position. I was saying to Ron over lunch that Jung says, and of course he couldn't demonstrate it in the teens by 1920, but he was saying that fundamentally there has to be a genetic or neurological basis for these differences. And now I think there's some evidence coming out, because Ron referred to a little bit of it earlier, that there is definitely a neurological basis of this. So I think that it's one of the practical things that I very often say, especially to parents who have more than one child, sometimes I'll phrase it as a question. Did you notice anything unique about your two children shortly after birth? And frequently the answer is, oh, they were already persons. They already had a personality. Distinct differences. Very shortly after, and as a pediatric psychiatrist, Steve, I presume you get that kind of comment also. How come these two kids are so different? They got the same parents. Are you able to comment on that, Steve?
Yes, both from being a father and a psychiatrist. But yeah, I would say you see that very early on. And our own two children from the very get-go were completely different. And yeah, I do think there's temperament and or typology that you see immediately, in essence. So it almost must be genetic to some degree. Yeah.
To answer the question, I think we have to say that there's really more theory than there is research on this. There is a fair amount of research on introverted extrovert. That I think we can say without any doubt that that's biological, which equals hereditary, which equals neurological substrate to this. And almost certainly the others, but there's been very little hard research to actually prove that. It's a little hard to get in there and do MRIs on people and see if you're an intuitive or a sensing or whatever. But the answer to the question is almost certainly yes. At least that's our belief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well,
then there's adaptation, there's adjustment, there's development of shadow and culture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's check in with the other sites. Mexico, do you have any questions?
Yes. I found this comment that the borderline personality organization was underlying all pathology, or was the basis of all pathology. And I was making a parallel with environmentalists that say that the edge between different ecosystems is the place with more fertility. So I was wondering whether the borderline personality organization also had this this great potentiality or these resources for transformation. I.e., it's not only something pathological, but it's also has a gold seed for transformation of the individual.
I love that. Thank you very much. My own proclivity towards this business of diagnosis is to use the term that I think I've coined. It fits within positive psychology of friendly diagnosis. When I look at somebody, I give them a whole array of tests, including the MBTI and the clinical examination. And I routinely said, we're first going to look at what's right with you. We're second going to look at what's right with you. Thirdly, we're going to look at what's right with you. Fourthly, we're going to look at other people. And way down the line, we're going to look at what's wrong with you. So come back to the borderline person. Borderline people very often are delightful. And I think because of their borderline condition, they are all over the place. And I think there's tremendous potential for brilliant success. Because we might say, yes, they haven't been attached properly, but perhaps they've been attached in an array of ways. And if we could find a coalescence of that kind of attachment, they could indeed be very successful. Did I address your question?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Again, it fits with underlying what's wrong is some kind of what's right in all circumstances. And it's sometimes real hard to do, right? I mean, I see men, and a number of men that I see are perpetrators of sexual offense, and it's a little difficult to sit in front of a pedophile and to know underneath this is something very good.
Thank you. Wilmington, any questions?
No questions at this time.
Okay, thank you. And Asheville, North Carolina, any questions in the room? Yes.
Yeah, I have a question. When you were talking about the introvert can be possessed by something in the inner world, the extrovert can be possessed by something in the outer world. Do I understand it correctly that in that system, the collective unconscious is considered to be in the inner world?
Yes.
Of the person?
Yes, you're understanding that correctly. It gets a little complicated. But I think that's a good way to put it. That it can be an idea, it can be a vision, it can be a belief, it can be an ideal, and of course that ideal could manifest, or that belief or vision could manifest in lots of ways. So that gets deeper into introverted thinking and feeling and those sorts of things, which we don't have time to go into today. But basically, I think the way to look at it is that what is neglected, if a person neglects his or her physical health and the psychological and somatic indices that are protesting the individual's engagement in something, then we've got an extroverted behavior going on here, which is excessive, all right? So if somebody is pushing himself to the point of exhaustion and starting to have cardiac problems and cholesterol problems and God knows what all else, okay, wait a minute. You're not paying attention to your essential physical nature, or you're getting these nightmares. All right, there you have it, certainly. Psyche is protesting with nightmares, what the person is doing. So there would be an excessive occupation, preoccupation, obsession with some outer world activity or engagement.
I would add maybe that the collective unconscious could be at least externalized in the form of statuary myth and other phenomena that at least reflect on that.
Oh, yes. Right. That's part of where it gets complicated. When a person is neglecting the outer world, just to take simple examples, doesn't eat, doesn't wash, is up all hours reading the book or writing or listening to music or composing music or painting or whatever, doesn't clean the house, doesn't pay the bills. Well, this is not adapting to the objective social and civic and world in which we live, because whatever is occupying consciousness excludes that, doesn't leave room for that. It's a good question. It does get subtle, and as I said earlier in the day, Jung says it's difficult to diagnose type sometimes because, you know, we're both adapting to the world to some extent, adapting to ourselves to some extent, and using all four of the functions to some extent. Some more adequately than others. Good question.
Thank you. Any other Asheville questions? Yes.
I'd like to propose an example. A daughter.
Hey, can you hear, Boris?
Can you hear?
Yeah. Move a little closer. Go in front of that microphone. There's a piece of paper over it. Pull that. There you go.
Can you hear? Can you hear? It's not working back here?
Can you hear, Boris, the question?
Can you hear anything?
Better.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Take, for example, a daughter born to a mother. The mother fails to attach to the child and vice versa because of maternal depression. And then later on, basically, she attaches more to the father because the father's the caretaker. But in early teen years, the father abuses the child by incest and other type of abuse. Is that a candidate for BPD? And after you say something, I'm going to follow up. Get that?
We'll need to have that repeated, Steve, if you can help us with that.
Could you try it one more time, Frederick? And maybe just summarize it a little bit more
okay,
so.
Well, a daughter born to a mother fails to go through attachment because the mother has maternal depression. And so the child attaches more to the father because he's the caretaker. But later on in early teen years, he abuses the child with incest and abuse. Is that a good candidate for borderline?
Did you catch that, or should I re-summarize that?
I think we have it.
Okay. Good.
Well, I think the answer, the simple answer to your question is quite possibly a candidate for borderline. But it sounds to me like we're using attachment here in a couple of different ways. It may be that the father-daughter relationship early on was really quite healthy in that the father actually saw the potential in the daughter, helped to develop that, helped to nurture that, to cultivate that, and at a certain point, some of the father's issues, sorry, Ron, some of the father's fantasies got in the way of the father-daughter relationship, and then the violation that took place. I don't know that that would necessarily lead to a borderline organization. It would lead to certainly damage and trauma. But in the sense that I'm using borderline or using attachment, it's that early wiring of the brain, so to speak, that gives a person a sense of who they are individually as themselves and who they are in the world. Now, if it starts out with early abuse, really early on, that's a different story. But I think it's this failure to resonate with, this failure to see that is so damaging, I think, to the infant and the child. You want to comment?
The objective data is that sexual abuse is highly related to borderline phenomena. A number of studies have shown that. There may be that may be an artifact of something else, but if you're sexually abused, the likelihood of borderline features will show for sure. We may not have a full-blown organization that's borderline. And of course, we mix here early attachment could be powerful, and then we have a undeveloped Oedipal relationship, and then we have sexual abuse eventually. It's a complex matter. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We have about a half hour left, and I think we need to end fairly on time, so we'll turn this back over to Chicago for the last segment.
Okay, let's see if we have Chicago questions here at this point. Yes.
What has happened, for example, with a child who developed an avoidant attachment to her mother, and now in her teens she doesn't want to deal with her mother and wants to cut off the relationship? Is that healthy to give this child the space that she wants from the mother, or you would need it to build that relationship no matter what? Or could be that other person could maybe substitute for that relationship, or it would ever be substituted?
In my mind, that's very complicated and would take individual answer to the specific situation. Having been in many of these, as you might imagine, some of them court-related, forensic matters here, if a child, almost at whatever age, has found let's say, a necessary distance from either parent, let's say mother, that can't be forced. If you push it, force it, even encourage it, you'll probably have the bungee effect. It'll go forward and then move backward even more. The difficulty here is you have other factors on the outside. If you have, a divorce situation where father is trying to augment that, mother hostility, that's conflictual. If you have other people, another sibling that really loves father or loves mother or something, so there are other factors. But if it were just simply the child wants to be, for whatever reason, detached from mother, I would say allow that to be there, allow it to be there. Don't encourage it, don't discourage it. It'll find its way back. It's a necessary tool, as it were. And then, frankly, if it becomes, in my mind, a weapon, then it needs to be examined much more carefully, and then you need to have an intervention. But a tool is, this is good for me for now. A weapon is, this is good for me, and I'm going to use it bad on you. Shall we move forward then? Let's. We have a half an hour. We may or may not take all of that, but at the bottom of page 15 and a number of other things here, we really want to look at all of these things together sort of simultaneously. We want to look at borderline, assessing all patients as borderline, which we did earlier, and then we want you to look at yourself as having a borderline or attachment features, and hence the transference and countertransference phenomena. So one of the things that we asked you to do earlier was to just examine how you felt about us, or thought about us, or interacted with us through this time. So I'll give you a few minutes to just muse about that, and then we'll come back to questions in a few minutes to deal with that. But if you don't mind, I'd like you to turn over to page 4 in the appendices, Appendix K, in this regard, in thinking about that. And I have found it valuable to have a paradigm where I ask people to say simply, is this good for you or is it bad for you? Good for you or bad for you, along a continuum. Very good, tolerable, not so good, bad, intolerable. So I think there's a continuum of good for me, bad for me. I don't make it sound simple, but that doesn't mean, to say good for me, bad for me, that it's pathological. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with you or wrong with what you're interfacing with, but I think the terminology is helpful to examine what is happening. And when I'm interacting as a therapist with a patient, or as a friend with another friend, or as a parent with a child, or whatever, to interact with that, this is good for me, this is not good for me, is very, very powerful. It's a place to start. It isn't necessarily a place where you end. And in looking at that, you really start with, do I like it? Do I not like it? I remember when my older daughter was 13, I discovered to my chagrin, extroverted as she was, that I didn't like her. Just didn't like her. Now, how can a father dare admit that he doesn't like his daughter? Well, frankly, most 13-year-old females are not very likable. Nor are most 15-year-old males. So, when I admitted that I didn't like her, of course I didn't tell her that. That's not digestible by somebody. But it didn't mean that there was something wrong with her. It didn't mean there was something wrong with me. We're getting a feedback, Steve. That's why I'm laughing. It meant that it was a place to start. And when I recognized that, I pretty quickly didn't have to dismiss that I didn't like her. It just wasn't important anymore. And then there were things about Chrissy that I didn't like that weren't important. But it was a place to start. And I think that's a way of looking at it. There's some subcategories of that I've put in this appendix, if you will. Good for me, bad for me, helpful, attractive, safe, and so on. I would suggest that you consider using that as a kind of a diagnostic tool before you come up with a formal pathology diagnosis or even introverted, extroverted diagnosis. Just, do you like this person? Do you not like him? Is this good for you? Is it bad for you? And then you can expand it not to the person, but to the activity. Do you like your job? Is it good for you? Mostly good for you? Mostly bad for you? How much are you tolerating and that sort of thing? So just wanted to comment on that as you maybe reflect on this whole matter as we're trying to sort of conclude here. So we're back to page 15 again in the main section. Do you have something you want to add? Okay. Yes.
Can you elaborate a little bit more about the transference and counter-transference phenomenon, taking account introverted personalities and all that? How that plays out in your clinical work?
The question, if you can't hear it, Steve, there or elsewhere, is been asked whether we can elaborate on the counter-transference phenomenon, particularly with the extroverted-introverted phenomenon. I have a number of thoughts. You want to go first?
I could certainly speak to that. I think I would. I can only really speak very personally about this, so that if a person is putting out a lot of data, in other words, talking a lot, talking too loudly, talking too intensely, standing too close, being too insistent, and these are all very much, these terms are colored by my own reaction, you know. I am going to try to distance myself, to protect myself. I can start to feel inundated. I can start to feel smothered. I can start to feel stuffed full. I can start to feel that somebody's got me. You know, they're holding me like this right up close. Very unpleasant experience. That's on the one side. The other extreme, and I'll speak to this in a moment, because it sounds paradoxical. The other extreme is a person who is so into what he is wanting to tell me. I'm thinking of a client at this point. So into what he is wanting to tell me that there is no connection, there is no contact. I am irrelevant. It's the old yes, mother, put down the phone, you know, and yes, dear, and put back the phone down. So that person is so much into what's going on in him and his mind and his feelings that his awareness of the outside world, of which I happen to be a part from his point of view, doesn't exist. And I get irritated and bored. So now it sounds like those are two contradictory experiences. But they're contradictory only in the sense that I and the other person are on different points of this introversion-extroversion spectrum. Okay? So now there is very distinctly a countertransference reaction that I'm well aware of. Now, the next step for me is, what do I do about it? In the first instance, I may ask the person to slow down or back off, or I may, in my worser moments, have something I urgently have to do, like go vomit, you know, or something like that. But try to get away, or try to make some space. Or if it's a person I know well enough, I say, hey, wait a minute, you know, you're overwhelming me. Slow down. Let me get a word in edgeways. Because that person, is that really extroversion? Or is that just sort of something else? That person is not taking me in, neither person is taking me into account. So that person, from their standpoint, they are not relating to what's outside of them. And it makes it very confusing. So is the first person who's pouring out all this stuff really extroverted? Or is that person just so much into what he or she is saying that it's just out there and doesn't care? This is where it gets confusing. So the first step is to notice. The second step is, what do I do about it? And that gets difficult. But I see you're ready to go.
Just briefly, and with a bit of embellishment, I don't like introverts. Now, the oddity of it is that all of my friends are introverted. My wife is introverted, and one of my 2 daughters are introverted. Okay? That doesn't mean that I abhor them. It's that I don't have the same energy. Now, that is dreadfully important for me to like him and to love him, to know that I don't like his introversion. That's not an easy thing to do, and a very important one. And it is a countertransference phenomenon. But once I acknowledge that, I actually forget about it. I probably haven't even said that, you know,
since our last breakfast.
Yes. So that's a countertransference, and that's what I said at the bottom of this appendix here, right? I mean, notice how you feel, and so it doesn't encumber you. You will have countertransference. Freud said countertransference starts in the first session. I think it starts in the phone call. You know, I mean, how many of you, those that are therapists, have had a phone call, and you get the phone call, well, I'm depressed, and my wife ran out on me, and my kids aren't doing this, and it's like, okay, you're borderline, and I don't like you, so I'll keep you at a distance, and then I know that. And then I don't have to worry about not liking him, but I know that I don't like him, and I know he's going to want everything. The other phenomenon, you know, because he spoke well of we extroverts who do what I'm doing now, you know, kind of invade people's territory. I have had to learn painfully that I have to be very careful of not getting sucked into that introverted black hole, because there's no end to questions. There's no end to reasoning and asking why. And I run out real quickly, and then I've given everything, and there's nothing more. And then he says, well, sorry, I guess I'm, you know, that's it. And so it's that sort of tension again. How that does to your question. But
Inspire me to think.
It's a very good question.
Right. Steve, in our last few minutes, I think I will then ask us here, or Asheville, or elsewhere, to dare to address what I have suggested earlier is, what have you thought or felt about yourself and or us during this session, and or anything that, I mean, open-ended question here as a result, I mean, anything that you want to address or comment. Fritz Perl said behind every question there's a statement, which I fully believe. You're certainly welcome to make a statement, but just as a sort of a procedure for looking at what, you know, has happened today with you. Hopefully something has happened profitably.
So right here in Chicago, anybody want to respond to Ron's invitation?
At lunch we had a break and we were talking about what a great example both of you were, the depth of respect that you had for each other and the understanding and the way you guys interact and showed just the way you interacted was a great example for us to observe right in front of us.
Thank you. Good. Thank you.
I'm not sure what the statement behind this question is, but it was interesting watching you two, and I just can't help but thinking, like, what if we could resurrect Jung? What would his response to the MBTI be, do you think?
Oh, Why, the first thing that comes to mind is he would say, I spent 20 years figuring it out, and I went through intellectual history figuring it out, and those jerks bastardized what I did.
Do you think he would be upset with the addition to it?
I don't think he would be upset with the additions to it. That the dimension of J and P that Ron mentioned, I think he would see that actually as useful. But I think that he would be very critical of the pigeonholing. He was already critical of that, and in the 3 essays or 2 essays at the end of volume 6, he's critical of that. He says, that's not what I wanted at all. And so that's why he puts his discussion of the specific types as the 10th chapter of this 500-page book. So now, if you read Psychological Types, if you want to read volume 6, if you want to read Jung's original work, do not start on page 1. Read the 2 prefaces. Read the original preface and the preface to the Argentine edition, which is also in volume 6, because that'll tell you something about what he's doing. And then go to his 1924 essay at the back of the book. Actually, it's a talk. There are 4 talks, 3 or 4 talks at the back of the book. One is 1913, that's very early, so you can skip that for the beginning. So the second and the third ones are particularly useful because he's talking to groups and he's spelling out what he did. And then you go to chapter 10 where he discusses introversion, extroversion, and the various types. And then if you want to get his intellectual basis for this, which was basically following through intellectual history, it's more of an answer you'd ask for, but you ask an introvert and you get on a roll. His first 9 chapters really, they're going through intellectual history to point out that for ages, for hundreds of years, people have struggled with this observable difference between groups of people. And so that's what he was dealing with. So back to your question, he would say, to some extent they bastardized my work, to some extent they added something useful, but they missed some other points which I'd love for them to carry on.
Anywhere else, Steve?
Yes, let's look around some. Let's go to Wilmington. Wilmington, do you have any concluding thoughts or a question as we wind down in a bit? Wilmington, North Carolina.
Let's say something. Okay. I'll have a comment. I think it's a real I think it's a real challenge to co-facilitate such deep and very powerful and profound information. And I've been checking in with myself throughout the afternoon. And one thing that I observed about myself in relationship or response or reaction to y'all's co-facilitation is I think it's really it was hard, not hard, but I didn't see much of a span or a difference between the introvert and the extrovert between the 2 of the presenters as y'all talked about that a lot. And I think that could be because sometimes in presenting we have to be outside of ourselves to do presenting. So I think it might be interesting at some point in time to maybe watch without hearing as well, because and maybe you folks, you fellas do a lot of co-facilitating together. So the introvert and the extrovert, I didn't see that much in your personalities, but I noticed in my personality as the day went on, I became much more introverted. So thank you. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
Good comment.
Thank you.
And Mexico, do you have any concluding thoughts or comments?
Well, the general opinion of the group, I've I may say so, is that it was fascinating to see the dance between introversion and extroversion in the presentation. It was very, very interesting to see. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you, Mexico. It's always such a delight to have the international feel that you bring to us. So thank you very much for your presence today. Really appreciate that. Asheville, any comments here about today's talk that you'd like to give? Some wearied shaking heads. I'd like to say, Boris and Ron, of course, I was present a year ago when we first did this conversation with each other. And for me, it's been impressive to see the transformation to some degree. The first one we did, initially you were sitting across one another. There was a less of a feel of connectedness from the virtual world to your world. Today, I was very aware of feeling like Chicago was right here. I mean, I felt like the two of you were in this classroom and were talking to us, and I was engaging more. And I felt that way with other distance learning, but there's been a real transformation from a year ago to now, and how connected the two of you seem, almost as if whatever began a year ago and the breakfasts that have continued over the decade have somehow blended the two. So I've really appreciated that transformation that I've seen from you.
Okay. We do have, I will make one last announcement. You will, people in Chicago and people in other places, if we can get their email address, Steve, will receive an email requesting that you fill out an evaluation. It's on what's known as SurveyMonkey. It's very simple, and that's very important for us, not only for you to say that how great we are, but but also how terrible we are, and then any other additional comments that you want to append to it. So if you get those emails, please do respond. I want to thank everybody in this room, in Asheville, in Flat Rock, in I don't know, did we ever get San Antonio up running? But folks in San Antonio, and those of you who are watching invisibly and silently on your PC or your Mac or your Linux or whatever you're watching on, glad to have you with us. Thank you very much for your participation.
One last thing as we do conclude. Yeah, thank you all. We do have another one in 3 weeks that I wanted to highlight. I forgot to mention earlier, but many of you have seen Murray Stein do similar presentations with us. He does really a phenomenal job as well. And 3 weeks from today, so in 3 short weeks, we'll be doing a second presentation on Carl Jung's Red Book, and that should be just a wonderful presentation as well. Do check in on our website as well as the Chicago Institute's website. There'll be things posted, including the blogs and new announcements, and we'll keep you all informed from there. So again, it was a pleasure hosting and co-hosting with Chicago. We wish you all well, and we'll see you later. And thank you again. Bye-bye.